Captain Sarah Chen adjusted her headset as the C-130 Hercules cut through the morning sky at 30,000 feet, the steady drone of the four turboprop engines providing a familiar soundtrack to what should have been a routine cargo run from Ramstein Air Base to a forward operating base in Eastern Europe. The cockpit was bathed in the golden light of dawn, and Sarah allowed herself a moment to appreciate the view, endless clouds stretching toward the horizon like a cotton sea. "Beautiful morning for flying," remarked her co-pilot, Lieutenant Jake Morrison, as he reached for his thermos of coffee. At 26, Jake was young but competent, with over 200 hours of flight time and an easy smile that made even the most stressful missions bearable. Sarah had flown with him dozens of times over the past year, and she trusted him implicitly. "Every morning's beautiful when you're above the clouds," Sarah replied, checking their navigation systems. At 34, she was one of the youngest female captains in the Air Force, having earned her rank through a combination of exceptional skill, nerves of steel, and an uncanny ability to remain calm under pressure. Her dark hair was pulled back in regulation style, and her brown eyes constantly scanned the instrument panel with the practiced efficiency of someone who had logged over 3,000 flight hours. Behind them in the cargo bay, she could hear their lone passenger moving around. General Marcus Harrison had boarded at the last minute, claiming he needed urgent transport to coordinate a classified operation. His credentials had checked out, and his authorization codes were valid, but something about the man had made Sarah uneasy from the moment he stepped aboard. Maybe it was the way his eyes never quite met hers, or how he seemed more interested in studying the aircraft's layout than reviewing whatever classified documents he claimed to be carrying. "Coffee's good today," Jake said, taking a long sip from his thermos. "Want some? I made extra." Sarah was about to decline when she noticed Jake's expression change. His face went pale, and the thermos slipped from his fingers, clattering to the cockpit floor and spilling coffee across the metal grating. "Jake," Sarah turned to look at him, alarm bells immediately going off in her head. "What's wrong?" Jake tried to speak, but only a strangled gasp emerged. His hands began to shake violently, and his eyes rolled back as his body went rigid. Within seconds, he was convulsing in his seat, foam appearing at the corners of his mouth. "Jake," Sarah reached for him, but he was already unconscious, his breathing becoming shallow and labored. She grabbed the emergency medical kit from behind her seat, her mind racing through possible causes. Heart attack, stroke, but he was young and healthy, with no history of medical problems. That's when she noticed the bitter almond smell emanating from the spilled coffee, a scent she recognized from her chemical warfare training. Cyanide. Someone had poisoned Jake's coffee. "Captain Chen." The voice came from directly behind her, calm and authoritative. General Harrison stood in the cockpit doorway, no longer the slightly nervous passenger who had boarded an hour earlier. His posture was different now, confident, predatory. "I need you to change course immediately." Sarah's hand moved instinctively toward the emergency radio, but Harrison was faster. He lunged forward and yanked the communication headset from her head, tossing it aside. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," he said, pulling a small device from his pocket. It looked like a modified cell phone, with several blinking lights and an extended antenna. "This little gadget is jamming all your communications. No one can hear you and you can't call for help." Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process what was happening. Jake was dying beside her, possibly already dead. The man she had trusted as a general was clearly something else entirely, and they were flying over increasingly hostile territory with no way to communicate with the outside world. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "That's not important right now," Harrison replied. "What matters is that you follow my instructions exactly. I need you to alter course to these coordinates." He handed her a slip of paper with latitude and longitude numbers written in precise handwriting. Sarah glanced at the coordinates and felt her blood run cold. They were deep in enemy territory, at least 200 miles from any friendly forces. I can't fly there. That's a restricted zone. We'll be shot down before we get within 50 miles. That's my concern, not yours, Harrison said. Your job is to fly the plane. My job is to ensure we reach our destination safely. And if I refuse? Harrison's expression hardened. Then you'll end up like your co-pilot. The poison I used on him is quite effective. Paralysis within minutes, death within an hour. I have more, and I'm not afraid to use it. Sarah looked at Jake's still form and felt a surge of rage. This monster had murdered an innocent man, someone who had never hurt anyone, who had a wife and 2 young children waiting for him back home. But she forced herself to remain calm. Anger wouldn't help Jake now, and it certainly wouldn't get her out of this situation alive. Why? She asked, stalling for time while her mind worked through possible options. What's so important about those coordinates? Let's just say I have friends waiting for me there. Friends who are very interested in the cargo we're carrying. Sarah's eyes widened as she realized what he meant. Their manifest listed routine supplies, medical equipment, communications gear, and food rations. But she knew that military cargo flights often carried more sensitive materials that weren't listed on the official paperwork. If Harrison was after classified equipment or intelligence, this wasn't just a hijacking, it was an act of treason. You're selling military secrets, she said, the pieces falling into place. Harrison smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I prefer to think of it as freelance consulting. The pay is much better than what Uncle Sam offers, and the retirement benefits are excellent. As if summoned by their conversation, Sarah's radar screen suddenly lit up with multiple contacts approaching from the east. Fighter jets, moving fast and heading directly toward them. Unidentified aircraft, this is Colonel Martinez of the 52nd Fighter Wing. A voice crackled through the radio speakers, somehow cutting through Harrison's jamming. You are entering restricted airspace. Alter course immediately or you will be fired upon. Harrison cursed and pulled out his jamming device, frantically adjusting settings. How are they getting through? Sarah realized that the emergency frequency was still functioning. Harrison's device wasn't sophisticated enough to block all military communications. But before she could take advantage of this knowledge, warning shots streaked past the cockpit windows, close enough that she could feel the aircraft shudder from the sonic booms. This is your final warning. Colonel Martinez's voice was deadly serious now. Exit restricted airspace immediately or we will engage. Harrison grabbed Sarah's shoulder, his fingers digging into her flesh. Tell them you're having mechanical difficulties. Tell them you need to make an emergency landing. They'll never believe that, Sarah protested. They can see we're flying normally. Then make it believable, Harrison snarled, pulling a pistol from inside his jacket. Cause some actual mechanical difficulties. Sarah stared at the weapon, her mind racing. If she damaged the aircraft's systems, she might not be able to control it well enough to land safely. But if she didn't comply, Harrison would kill her, and the plane would crash anyway, taking whatever secrets he was after down with it. More warning shots flashed past the windows, closer this time. The fighter jets were running out of patience, and Sarah knew that the next shots wouldn't be warnings. Captain Chen, Colonel Martinez's voice was urgent now. We're reading your emergency beacon. Are you in distress? Emergency beacon. Sarah's eyes flicked to the instrument panel and saw that Jake had somehow managed to activate the distress signal before losing consciousness. The beacon was broadcasting their exact location and status to every military installation within 500 miles. Harrison saw her looking at the beacon and raised his pistol. Turn it off, now. I can't, Sarah lied. It's automatic once activated. Only ground control can shut it down. The truth was that she could disable the beacon with the flip of a switch, but she wasn't about to tell Harrison that. As long as it kept broadcasting. There was hope that someone would figure out what was really happening aboard their aircraft. Unidentified C-130, you have 30 seconds to exit restricted airspace, Colonel Martinez announced. We are authorized to use deadly force. Harrison pressed the gun against Sarah's temple. Change course to my coordinates. Do it now, or I'll paint the cockpit with your brains and fly this thing myself. Sarah's hands moved to the controls, but instead of changing course, she began a series of subtle maneuvers that would appear random to Harrison, but would actually spell out a distress code in Morse using the aircraft's movement pattern. It was a technique she had learned in survival school, a way to communicate when all other methods had failed. "What are you doing?" Harrison demanded, noticing the slight course corrections. "Avoiding the fighters," Sarah replied. "If I fly in a straight line, they'll have an easier shot." It was a plausible explanation, and Harrison seemed to accept it. But Sarah could see on her radar that the pursuing aircraft were matching her movements, staying in formation. They were reading her message. Suddenly, Jake stirred in his seat, a low moan escaping his lips. He was still alive, though barely conscious. Sarah felt a surge of hope. If Jake could recover enough to help her, they might have a chance. "He should be dead by now," Harrison muttered, glancing at the co-pilot with annoyance. "Maybe you didn't use enough poison," Sarah suggested, hopping to plant doubt in Harrison's mind about his own competence. Harrison's jaw tightened. "It doesn't matter. He's in no condition to help you, and we're running out of time. Those fighters aren't going to wait much longer." As if to emphasize his point, another burst of warning shots lit up the sky around them, so close that Sarah could smell the cordite from the tracer rounds. "Last warning, C-130, Colonel Martinez's voice was grim. Exit restricted airspace or we will shoot you down." Sarah looked at her instruments, calculating distances and fuel consumption. They were still over friendly territory, but barely. In another few minutes, they would cross into the disputed zone where the rules of engagement became much more complicated. Harrison leaned closer, his breath hot against her ear. "Choose, Captain. Die here as a hero or live long enough to land where I need you to go. Either way, I get what I want, but only one option keeps you breathing." Sarah's hands tightened on the controls as she realized the full scope of the trap she had fallen into. Harrison had planned this perfectly, poisoning Jake to eliminate her support, jamming communications to isolate her, and timing the flight path to force her into restricted airspace, where she would have to choose between certain death from friendly fire or compliance with his demands. But he had made one crucial mistake. He had underestimated her. Sarah's fingers danced across the instrument panel with practiced precision, her mind working through calculations that could mean the difference between life and death. Harrison stood behind her, gun pressed against her neck, but she forced herself to ignore the cold metal and focus on the impossible equation before her. How to save Jake, stop a traitor, and survive the next 10 minutes without getting shot down by her own forces. "Time's up, Captain," Harrison growled. "Change course now or—" "I'm doing it," Sarah interrupted, her voice steady as she began inputting new coordinates into the navigation system. But the numbers she entered weren't Harrison's destination. Instead, she was programming a complex flight path that would take them through a series of waypoints, each one designed to buy her precious time while appearing to comply with his demands. The first waypoint would take them southeast, toward Harrison's coordinates, but then the route would curve back northwest through a mountain range where radar coverage was spotty. If she could reach those mountains, she might be able to break Harrison's communication jamming and call for help. "Smart choice," Harrison said, relaxing slightly as he watched the aircraft begin its turn. "I knew you were too intelligent to throw your life away for nothing." Sarah bit back her response. Let him think he was winning. The autopilot engaged with a soft chime, and she used the moment to glance at Jake. His breathing was shallow but steady, and she could see his eyelids fluttering. The poison hadn't killed him, yet, but without medical attention, he wouldn't last much longer. "How long does he have?" she asked, nodding toward her co-pilot. Harrison shrugged. "An hour, maybe two. Depends on his body weight and metabolism. Why, planning to play doctor?" "Just wondering if you're as good at murder as you think you are." Harrison's eyes flashed with anger, but before he could respond, Colonel Martinez's voice crackled through the radio again. "C-130, we're tracking your course change. Be advised you are still heading toward restricted airspace. Confirm your intentions." Sarah reached for the radio, but Harrison grabbed her wrist. "Careful what you say, Captain. Remember, I can hear every word." Sarah keyed the microphone. "This is Captain Chen. We have a medical emergency aboard. Co-pilot is unconscious, possibly poisoned. Requesting immediate medical assistance and clearance to land at nearest facility." It was a calculated risk. She was telling the truth about Jake's condition, which would explain their erratic behavior, but she was also hoping that Martinez would read between the lines and realize something was seriously wrong. "Copy that, Captain Chen. We're vectoring medical assistance to your location. What is the nature of the poisoning?" Harrison pressed the gun harder against her neck, a clear warning. Sarah chose her words carefully. "Unknown substance. Symptoms include paralysis and respiratory distress. Suspect chemical agent." There was a long pause before Martinez responded. "Understood, Captain. We're scrambling a medical team. Maintain current heading and altitude." Harrison smiled grimly. "Very good. You managed to call for help without actually calling for help, but it won't matter. By the time any medical team reaches us, we'll be long gone." Sarah said nothing, but she was already working on her next move. The autopilot was following her programmed route, but she had built in several decision points where she could manually override the system. The first one was coming up in 3 minutes, a sharp turn that would take them into a narrow valley between two mountain peaks. She glanced at her fuel gauge. They had enough for maybe 2 more hours of flight time, depending on altitude and weather conditions. Harrison's coordinates were still 90 minutes away, but her secret destination, a heavily fortified NATO base hidden in the mountains, was only 40 minutes if she could execute her plan. "Tell me something," Sarah said, trying to keep Harrison talking while she prepared for the upcoming maneuver. "How long have you been planning this? This isn't something you put together overnight." Harrison seemed pleased by her interest. 3 years, he said proudly. "Ever since I realized that my country was more interested in politics than protecting its people. Do you know how many good soldiers have died because of bureaucratic incompetence? How many missions have failed because some desk jockey in Washington was more worried about public opinion than military effectiveness? So you decided to sell out to the highest bidder." "I decided to work with people who appreciate results over rhetoric," Harrison corrected. "My new employers understand the value of good intelligence. They pay well, and they don't second-guess every decision." Sarah felt sick. She had known traitors existed, but hearing one justify his betrayal so casually was nauseating. "What about Jake? What did he ever do to you?" "Wrong place, wrong time," Harrison said without emotion. "I needed to isolate you and he was in the way, nothing personal." The first waypoint was approaching. Sarah's hands moved to the manual controls, ready to override the autopilot. "You know they'll never let you live," she said. "Once you've outlived your usefulness, your new employers will eliminate you. That's how these things work." "Maybe," Harrison admitted, "but I'll be rich enough to disappear completely. New identity, new life, somewhere warm with no extradition treaties." "If you live that long." Sarah's hand moved to the autopilot disconnect switch. In 5 seconds, she would take manual control and execute the most dangerous flying of her career. But first, she needed Harrison distracted. "What's in the cargo bay?" she asked. "What's so valuable that you're willing to commit treason for it?" Harrison's eyes lit up with greed. "Prototype communication encryption devices. Next-generation technology that won't be deployed for another 5 years. My buyers are very interested in staying ahead of the curve." That was all Sarah needed to hear. She flipped the autopilot disconnect and yanked the control yoke hard to the left, throwing the massive aircraft into a steep banking turn that sent Harrison stumbling across the cockpit. "What the hell are you doing?" Harrison shouted, trying to regain his balance as the plane tilted at a 45-degree angle. "Avoiding a mountain," Sarah lied, fighting the controls as the aircraft plunged into the narrow valley she had been aiming for. The walls of rock flashed past the windows, so close she could see individual trees and boulders. Harrison struggled to his feet, raising his pistol again. "Get back on course, now." "I can't," Sarah shouted over the roar of the engines. "The downdrafts in this valley are too strong. I have to follow the terrain or we'll crash into the mountainside." It wasn't entirely a lie. Flying through mountain valleys was genuinely dangerous, especially in an aircraft as large as the C-130. But Sarah had trained for this kind of flying, and she knew the terrain from previous missions. More importantly, she knew that the steep canyon walls would block Harrison's jamming signal and allow her to reestablish communication with the outside world. The radio crackled to life as they descended deeper into the valley. "Captain Chen, this is Mountain Base Control. We're reading your emergency beacon. What is your status?" Sarah's heart leaped. Mountain Base was the NATO facility she had been trying to reach, a heavily defended installation that specialized in electronic warfare and intelligence gathering. If anyone could help her, it would be them. But before she could respond, Harrison lunged forward and grabbed the radio microphone. "Everything's fine," he said, trying to disguise his voice. "Just some turbulence. Continuing to original destination." "Negative," came the immediate response. "Voice pattern analysis indicates you are not Captain Chen. Identify yourself immediately." Harrison cursed and threw the microphone aside. "Clever," he snarled at Sarah, "but it won't save you." Sarah was already working on her next move. The valley was opening up ahead, leading to a series of interconnected canyons that would eventually bring them to Mountain Base. But she needed to lose Harrison first, and she had an idea. "We're losing altitude too fast," she announced, pulling back on the controls. "I need to climb out of this valley or we'll hit the ground." "Then do it," Harrison snapped. Sarah began a steep climb, but instead of heading for open sky, she aimed for a narrow gap between two peaks, a passage barely wide enough for the C-130's wingspan. It was a maneuver that required split-second timing and absolute precision. "Are you insane?" Harrison screamed as he saw the rock walls rushing toward them. "You'll kill us all." "Maybe," Sarah replied grimly, "but at least I'll die knowing I stopped a traitor." The aircraft shot through the gap with less than 10 feet of clearance on either side. Sarah could hear the engines straining as she pushed them to their limits, fighting against the mountain winds that threatened to slam them into the unforgiving stone. Harrison was thrown against the cockpit wall as the plane bucked and rolled through the turbulence. His pistol went flying, clattering somewhere behind the pilot's seats. Sarah saw her chance and reached for the emergency radio frequency, but Harrison recovered faster than she expected. "You bitch!" he roared, launching himself at her. His hands closed around her throat, squeezing with desperate strength. Sarah couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, but she kept her hands on the controls. The aircraft was still flying through the mountain pass, and any loss of control would send them crashing into the peaks. She tried to elbow Harrison in the ribs, but he was too strong, his grip tightening around her windpipe. Black spots began to dance at the edges of her vision. In seconds, she would lose consciousness and they would all die. But then she heard a weak voice from the co-pilot's seat. "Get away from her." Jake was awake, barely conscious but fighting against the poison in his system. His hand fumbled for the emergency fire extinguisher mounted beside his seat. Harrison turned at the sound, loosening his grip on Sarah's throat just enough for her to gasp in a breath of air. Jake triggered the fire extinguisher, filling the cockpit with a cloud of chemical foam that sent Harrison stumbling backward, coughing and temporarily blinded. Sarah seized the moment, grabbing the radio microphone. "Mountain Base, this is Captain Chen. I have a hostile aboard my aircraft. Repeat, I have been hijacked by a hostile passenger, requesting immediate assistance." "Copy that, Captain Chen. We have fighters en route to your location. Can you maintain control of your aircraft?" "Affirmative," Sarah replied, wiping foam from her eyes as she fought to keep the plane level. "But I have a critically injured co-pilot who needs immediate medical attention." Harrison was recovering from the chemical foam, his eyes streaming but his rage undiminished. He spotted his pistol on the floor and dove for it, but Sarah was ready for him. She threw the aircraft into a sudden dive, using gravity to slam Harrison against the cockpit ceiling. "You're going to get us all killed," Harrison shouted as he crashed back to the floor. "Only if you keep fighting me," Sarah replied. "Surrender now and I'll get us down safely." But Harrison wasn't finished. As he reached for his weapon again, Sarah realized that her gambit had only bought her time. The real battle was just beginning, and the outcome would determine not just their survival, but the fate of the classified technology in their cargo bay. The radio crackled with a new voice. "Captain Chen, this is General Morrison. We have your location and are tracking your aircraft. Be advised, we have intelligence suggesting your passenger may be armed with explosive devices. Can you confirm?" Sarah's blood ran cold. If Harrison had a bomb aboard, her desperate flying through the mountains had just made their situation infinitely worse. Sarah's hands trembled on the controls as General Morrison's words echoed through the cockpit. Explosive devices. The thought sent ice through her veins, but she forced herself to stay focused. Harrison was still on the floor, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead where he'd hit the ceiling, but his eyes held a dangerous gleam. "Is it true?" Sarah demanded, her voice cutting through the engine noise. "Do you have a bomb?" Harrison wiped blood from his face and smiled, a cold, calculating expression that made Sarah's skin crawl. "What do you think? Did you really believe I'd come aboard a military aircraft without insurance?" He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small device about the size of a smartphone. Red LED numbers glowed on its surface: 0847, 0846, 0845. "Dead man's switch," Harrison said, holding up his thumb to show a small button he was pressing. "If I let go, or if my heart stops beating, this entire aircraft becomes a very expensive firework. 8 minutes and counting." Sarah's mind raced. 8 minutes to land a massive cargo plane, subdue an armed traitor, and somehow disarm a bomb, all while keeping Jake alive and avoiding being shot down by her own forces. The mathematics of survival had just become impossibly complex. "Mountain Base, this is Captain Chen," she said into the radio, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. "Confirm hostile has explosive device with dead man's switch. Timer shows 8 minutes, requesting immediate bomb disposal guidance." "Negative, Captain," came the grim response. "No time for disposal. You need to get that aircraft on the ground immediately. We're clearing emergency runway 27, ETA to touchdown." Sarah checked her instruments. They were still in the mountains, at least 15 minutes from Mountain Base even at maximum speed. But there was another option, a frozen lake she'd spotted during their wild flight through the canyons. It was risky, potentially suicidal, but it might be their only chance. "I'm not going to make it to base," Sarah announced. "I'm going to attempt an emergency landing on Lake Kristoff. It's our only shot." "Captain, that lake ice may not support the weight of a C-130. General Morrison's voice was tight with concern. "Then we'll find out together," Sarah replied, banking the aircraft toward the lake. "Jake, can you hear me?" Her co-pilot's eyes fluttered open, The poison was still in his system, but he was fighting it with everything he had. "I'm here," he whispered. "I need you to help me with the landing sequence. Can you reach the gear controls?" Jake's hand moved slowly toward the landing gear lever. "I'll try." Harrison laughed bitterly. "You're all going to die anyway. Even if you survive the landing, my associates will be waiting. They have surface-to-air missiles positioned around that lake. The moment you touch down, they'll blow you out of the water." "Then why the bomb?" Sarah asked, beginning her descent toward the lake. "Why not just let them shoot us down?" "Because I need those encryption devices intact," Harrison replied. "The bomb is just to ensure you don't try anything heroic after we land. My people will extract the cargo and eliminate any witnesses." Sarah's jaw tightened. Harrison had planned for every contingency except one. He had underestimated her determination to stop him. As the lake grew larger in the windscreen, she began formulating a desperate plan. "Jake, when I give the signal, I need you to cut all electrical power except for essential flight controls. Can you do that?" Jake nodded weakly, his hand moving toward the electrical panel. "What are you doing?" Harrison demanded, the timer in his hand now showing 06:23. "Preparing for a water landing," Sarah lied. "I need to reduce the risk of electrical fires." The truth was more complex. If she could cut power to the aircraft's transponder and navigation lights, Harrison's associates on the ground would lose track of their exact position. In the confusion, she might be able to land somewhere unexpected. The lake was directly ahead now, its frozen surface gleaming like a mirror in the afternoon sun. Sarah could see dark patches where the ice was thinner, and she aimed for the thickest section near the northern shore. But as they descended, she spotted something that made her blood run cold. Several vehicles positioned around the lake's perimeter, exactly as Harrison had warned. "There," Harrison pointed through the windscreen. "My extraction team, right on schedule." Sarah counted at least 6 vehicles, including what looked like military-grade equipment. Harrison's associates were well-armed and well-prepared, but she also noticed something Harrison had missed. The vehicles were positioned for a landing on the lake's main body, not near the narrow inlet where she was actually heading. "Jake, now!" she shouted. Jake's hand slammed down on the electrical cutoff switches, plunging the aircraft into semi-darkness. Only the essential flight instruments remained active, their dim glow barely illuminating the cockpit. "What the hell?" Harrison began, but Sarah was already executing her plan. Instead of landing on the main lake where Harrison's team was waiting, she aimed for a narrow channel that fed into the larger body of water. It was barely wide enough for the C-130's wingspan, and the ice looked dangerously thin, but it would put them almost a mile from the extraction team. The aircraft hit the ice with tremendous force, the frozen surface cracking like thunder beneath the massive weight. Sarah fought to keep the plane straight as it skidded across the slippery surface, chunks of ice flying past the windows like shrapnel. "You crazy bitch!" Harrison screamed as the aircraft slid sideways, its wing-tip barely missing a cluster of pine trees. "You'll kill us all." The timer in his hand showed 04:17 and counting down. Sarah used the aircraft's momentum to slide toward a small island in the middle of the channel. Hopping the trees would provide cover from Harrison's extraction team. The C-130 came to rest with its nose buried in a snowbank, the engines finally falling silent after their harrowing journey. "End of the line," Sarah announced, unbuckling her harness. "Time to finish this." Harrison was on his feet instantly, the bomb timer still clutched in his hand. "Nobody moves. We wait here until my team arrives." But Sarah had other plans. During the landing, she had spotted something that gave her hope, a small emergency beacon mounted near the cargo bay door. If she could activate it, it would broadcast their exact location to every rescue team in the area. "Your team is going to have a hard time finding us," Sarah said, moving slowly toward the back of the cockpit. "We're not where you told them we'd be." "They'll find us," Harrison snarled, "and when they do—" His words were cut off by the sound of gunfire in the distance. Through the cockpit windows, Sarah could see muzzle flashes near the main lake. Harrison's extraction team was under attack. "Mountain Base to Captain Chen," the radio crackled to life. "We have special forces engaging hostile ground units at your last known position. What is your current status?" Sarah lunged for the radio, but Harrison was faster. He grabbed her arm and pressed the bomb trigger closer to his chest. "One word and we all die right now." The timer showed 02:45. "Your friends are losing," Sarah observed, watching the distant firefight. "Looks like my people were ready for them." Harrison's face was pale with rage and fear. "It doesn't matter. In 2 minutes this bomb goes off and destroys everything. The encryption devices, the evidence, all of it." "Including you," Sarah pointed out. "I'm dead anyway," Harrison replied. "At least this way I take you with me." Sarah looked at Jake, who was struggling to stay conscious in his seat. She thought about his wife and children, about the classified technology in the cargo bay, about all the soldiers who would die if that equipment fell into enemy hands. She had come too far to give up now. "Jake," she said quietly, "can you reach the fire suppression system?" Jake's eyes met hers, and she saw understanding flicker in them. The aircraft's fire suppression system used halon gas, which would displace oxygen in the cargo bay. If she could trigger it while fighting Harrison for the bomb. "You're not going to," Harrison began, but Sarah was already moving. She threw herself at Harrison, grabbing for the bomb timer with both hands. They crashed to the floor of the cockpit, wrestling desperately as the device showed 0123, 0122, 0121. Harrison was stronger, but Sarah was fighting for more than just her own life. She managed to get one hand on the timer while using her other elbow to strike at Harrison's throat. He gasped and loosened his grip just enough for her to see the device clearly. It wasn't a bomb at all. The timer was actually a GPS tracker with a countdown display, probably set to coordinate with his extraction team's arrival. Harrison had been bluffing about the explosives, using psychological warfare to control her. "You son of a bitch," Sarah breathed, realizing how completely he had manipulated her fear. Harrison saw the recognition in her eyes and knew his deception was over. He released the fake bomb and went for his pistol instead, but Sarah was ready for him. She grabbed a heavy flashlight from the emergency kit and brought it down hard on his wrist, sending the gun skittering across the cockpit floor. "Jake, hit the emergency beacon," Sarah shouted as she and Harrison continued to struggle. Jake's hand found the beacon switch, and immediately the cockpit filled with the piercing wail of the distress signal. Within seconds, Sarah could hear helicopters approaching from multiple directions. Harrison made one last desperate attempt to reach his weapon, but Sarah tackled him again, this time managing to pin his arms behind his back. She used zip ties from the emergency kit to secure his wrists, then sat back against the cockpit wall, breathing heavily. "Mountain Base, this is Captain Chen," she said into the radio. "Hostile is secured. Repeat, hostile is in custody. We need immediate medical assistance for my co-pilot." "Copy that, Captain. Medical team is inbound. Outstanding work." As the sound of rescue helicopters grew louder, Sarah looked at Harrison, who was glaring at her with undisguised hatred. 3 years of planning," she said, shaking her head. "All that betrayal, all that murder, and for what? A fake bomb and a GPS tracker." Harrison said nothing, but Sarah could see the defeat in his eyes. His carefully orchestrated plan had fallen apart because he had underestimated the determination of the people he was trying to betray. Jake stirred in his seat, his color slowly returning as the poison worked its way out of his system. "Sarah," he whispered, "remind me never to fly with you again. This was supposed to be a routine cargo run. Sarah laughed, the sound slightly hysterical after everything they had been through. Next time, I'm checking everyone's coffee before we take off. As the rescue teams landed on the ice around their aircraft, Sarah reflected on the events of the past few hours. Harrison would face court-martial and life in prison for treason and attempted murder. The classified encryption devices were safe, and most importantly, Jake was going to survive. It had been the longest flight of her career, but also the most important. Sometimes, Sarah realized, the most routine missions turned out to be anything but routine.